I'm going to start with my experience. I got out of treatment in summer of 1984, and I came back to Nashville, and I set out to follow this aftercare plan. And at the end of 4.5 months, I had done everything except get a sponsor. And today, I think it's the funniest thing that I have ever done or heard. But I was looking for a sponsor I could relate to. Hey, Wes, I mean, the shape I was in, who could I relate to? I could relate to the squirrel on the next branch, right? I didn't need a squirrel for a sponsor. I needed a winner for a sponsor. I didn't need a sponsor I could relate to. I needed one I would obey. Concept I didn't have. And so anyway, I was thrashing around looking for this sponsor, and I've been told to use a sponsor. I didn't have any idea what that meant. And so I set out on the impossible mission. And I was sitting in a meeting in outside of Nashville, and a fellow named Sonny was chairing it. And all I could think of through that meeting was that I hadn't gotten a sponsor yet. And it was making me crazy. So I went up to him. I said, "Would you sponsor me?" He said, "Sure. Here's my home number. Here's my work number. Call me." That was on a Friday night. So I waited till the following Tuesday. But I felt better because I had a sponsor. Okay. Waited till the following Tuesday, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I called Sonny at work. I said, "Hey, Sonny, it's Scott." He said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I realized today if I'd said no, I'm not okay, he would have dropped everything and taken my call." But I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." He says, "Well, I'm at work and I'm swamped." See, Sonny had been sober so long that when he went to work, he actually worked. It was a concept I didn't have yet. And so he was at work, he was working. And he said, "Man, I'm just swamped. Call me another time." I said, "Okay." And I felt really better. I'd called my sponsor. So I waited a couple of 3 days. I called him at 2 in the afternoon at work. Fill in the blanks. And so I'm not getting anything out of this. In the meantime, I'm watching this other guy at another meeting, and his lights are on. This guy is just lit up with what's going on in this fellowship and in his life. And I wanted to feel like it looked like he felt. Don't know how to tell it any better than that. So I asked him if he'd sponsor me, and he said, "You already have a sponsor." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, tell him he's fired, and I'll be your sponsor." I said, "Oh, what an order. I can't... And I thought, oh, man, but this thing is not working with Sonny. You know, he's at work, and I know I need a sponsor. So I waited till Friday night, which is the only meeting I was seeing Sonny at, because I didn't figure that you should do something like this over the phone. And with heavy heart, I went to the Oak Hill meeting to devastate this man's life. But for those of you who are new, I hope you're hearing the laughter here, okay? Because that was intended to be funny, all right? By telling him that he was no longer going to sponsor me. And I knew if I waited till the end of the meeting, I'd chicken out. So I went up to him immediately, because he got there early. I went to him immediately, and I said, "Sonny, I've asked somebody else to be my sponsor." And he said, "Great. Who?" So I told him. He said, "Good. He knows the book. He can coach you through the work." Then he said something I didn't understand for 2 full years. He said, "This wasn't working for me either." And he said, "Don't lose my number. I got to go make coffee." He was gone. I thought, what happened? So I went back to the other guy, and I said, "Okay, I fired him. Now sponsor me." And the guy said, "Okay, I will, but we're going to have to do it my way." I said, "Okay." And he said, "You are too sick to stay sober on the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. You will need the program also." And I got no idea what this man's talking about. I didn't know. And he said that he believed the best kept secret in our fellowship was the definition of the program. And he said, "The way we keep it secret, we read it at every meeting." It's a sentence before the first step. "Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery." So the steps are not part of the program. They are the program. No steps, no program, that simple. And he insisted that I do the step work. I'm going to save a lot of that story for later on this evening when I tell my story. But that was the beginning of my recovery. But I look back on Sonny. Sonny was sober at that time about 10 years. He died sober around 20 years. And would have made a fine sponsor for me if I'd called him at a legitimate time and done some things. But what I learned from that was that he didn't have any ego tied up in sponsoring me. And when he said it wasn't working for me either, I eventually understood that it was a two-way street. I thought when I said, "Would you sponsor me?" what I was saying was, "I'm a dead weight, would you drag me?" It's not the case. It's not the case. Today, when I asked the man who's now sponsoring me to sponsor me, what I was saying was, "I believe you're on the path. May I walk beside you? We will help each other." And no matter how new you are, that's what you're saying. That's what it's about. It's about help each other. I've come to believe that there are no one-way streets in the kingdom. That you cannot receive without giving and you can't give without receiving. I don't believe it can be done because I've watched it too many times in sponsorship. I've received so much from the men who allow me to sponsor them. So I started out doing this work and I stayed sober on borrowed faith. I don't know how to say it any better than that, but Jerry let me borrow his faith. I wasn't sure this would work for me. I wasn't sure I was going to make it, but I was sure he was. And he was sure that I was if I did it his way. And I borrowed that faith from him, and I did it his way, and he changed my life. It changed my life. And he coached me through not the steps on the wall. They tell me that if you take the steps off the wall, you get an off-the-wall program. The big part. The preface to the third edition says that the 12 steps summarize our program. That the steps we see on the wall are a summary. And he said I was so sick I needed the whole thing. That the summary wasn't going to be enough for me. I was going to have the whole thing right out of the book. And so that's what we did, and it changed me. And so I'll talk about that again tonight too. I found on page 96 in the text definition of sponsorship. Now this is in the chapter Working with Others. And it's been talking for a couple of pages about a 12-step call where you go see somebody, you tell about your drinking, and they tell about theirs, and you laugh a little bit, and you leave them the book. And in 3 sentences here, for me, they define sponsorship. It says, suppose you are now making your second visit to a man. He has read this volume and says he is prepared to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. So for me, that's a definition of someone who's sponsorable. He's read the steps and says he is willing, or says he's prepared to go through. It doesn't say eager. We don't see eager very much, do we? But it says he's prepared to go through with the 12 steps. And then it says, having had the experience yourself, you can give him much practical advice. What experience? The experience of doing the 12 steps. What advice? Advice on how to do the 12 steps. And when I hold it to that, I think I'm well within the confines of what's recommended here in the book. And that becomes my responsibility, is to coach someone through this work so that they can have the change that I've been blessed with. I saw a movie when I was a kid. It was black and white, and it was the frogmen went in and blew up the bridge or whatever it was, and then to be recovered, they swam about 300 yards out to sea, half a mile, whatever it was, and they lined themselves, there were about 5 of them, and they lined themselves up maybe 150 yards apart, parallel to the beach. And the submarine, much further out, had launched a rubber raft. If you watch Jacques Cousteau, it's one of those Zodiac things that's got a pointy end on it and an outboard motor on the back, and there are 2 guys in it. One's in the back operating the motor and driving, and the other one is laying up on the front of it on the starboard side, and he's got what looks like a bicycle inner tube looped over his right shoulder, so it sort of sticks out. And he's laying on the front of this thing. And the guy in the back lines up on these fellas in the water. The fella in the water facing him sticks his hand up in the air and makes a fist and points his hand at the boat. And as they come flying by, this guy loops him with his bicycle inner tube and flips him back up into the boat because the bad guys are on the beach shooting at him. So they're flying down through there and he's flipping them back up on the boat. That guy laying up on the front of the boat, you know what his number one responsibility is? Most important thing he does? Stay in the boat. Okay? Stay in the boat. Because if he gets pulled out, it's over. To me, that whole thing talks to sponsorship. Here we are, God in the back, right? We know who's driving. And we're roaring down through here, and all these guys are out in the water. And I'm laying up on the front of this boat with this loop. And as we come to somebody, he's got his hand pushed. Some of them, just as you get there, pull their hand down. Or some of them, you get them and you flip them into the back, and they bounce once and go out the other side. Or some of them are hanging on to something that's so heavy that you can't flip them, and whatever they're hanging on to, Sandy Beach calls it the rock, you can't flip all that back up into the boat, and you can't talk them into dropping it. And some of them we don't get lined up on. But whatever happens, my first and most important responsibility, stay in the boat. Stay in the boat. That movie really helped me so much with this perspective of what sponsorship is. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but A fellow named Don, who I know that James knew in Nashville, Don R., was my sponsor for a number of years. And he died in May, will be 3 years ago. And I needed a sponsor. And I set out to replace Don initially. That only lasted a few days, and I realized that wasn't going to happen. And it occurred to me that what I needed was a sponsor. And Don had been my 5th sponsor. And those guys, those 5 men no one's ever had better sponsorship than I have. I sincerely believe that. So I asked myself this question: what were the common characteristics of these guys who had sponsored me? And if I could establish what those were, maybe I could find someone else around me who had those characteristics. For me, this is what they were. All of them were men. I don't sponsor women, and I'm not sponsored by women. I'm easily confused. And I haven't seen an unattractive lady since the summer I turned 12. And so I can't afford to be confused, because this is life or death. So I have to have a man sponsor. And it has to be a man who's done the 12 steps, because his primary job is to have me in the step work. And at my home group, they say, you can't anymore give away something you ain't got. Then you can come back from somewhere you ain't been. So it had to be someone who'd done the 12 steps. It had to be someone who had a sponsor himself. I think that means that he's surrendered. And it also means that the first time I come to him with a question he can't answer, we got a plan. We don't have to fish around and figure out what we're going to do. We're going to his sponsor. It had to be somebody who was active in service work. It has been my experience that the winners are all doing something to give it back. It is my own personal belief that the only thing gratitude and attitude have in common is that they rhyme. To me, gratitude is action. It has to do with go and do. The winners are coming early and setting up and making the coffee, and they're staying late and tearing down, and they're the treasurer of the group, and they're taking meetings in the treatment centers and jails. They are doing something. So I needed somebody who was active in service work. I needed somebody who would tell me the truth, most especially when I didn't want to hear it about myself. And page 132 in the text, a wonderful line, most of you know what I'm going to quote now, says, we absolutely insist on enjoying life. So I needed someone who laughed a lot. I believe that laughter is the sound effect of recovery. And I needed a sponsor who was living the kind of life that I wanted to live, because that's what I drank for. It's so that I could feel good. So I had to find somebody who was feeling good without that, so that I could learn to do the things that he was doing. Had to be somebody that laughed a lot. Not all the time. He had to feel his other feelings too. But mostly, it had to be somebody who was having a good time. And I put those 6 characteristics together, and I looked around, and there stood Ice Cream Steve. And I gave Ice Cream Steve, I had the privilege of giving him his 16-year chip last Sunday in the back room. And he's my sponsor. And if you get the chance to meet him, he's all of those. And I could talk a long time about Steve. But he's a beautiful guy, and he, kind of funny, I want to talk a little bit about surrender, too, because that was worth so much to me. I was blessed with sufficient quantities of pain to reach what I call bottom. And to me, bottom didn't have anything to do with the physical plane. It didn't have to do with what my wife and kids felt about me. It didn't have to do with what was going on in my job. It didn't have to do with the fact that I puked blood a couple of times. None of that was bottom. Bottom for me was of the spirit. It was in here when I hurt bad enough that I was willing to pay any price or do anything to not be the man that I had been before. And at that point, I was at bottom, and I was trainable. And I need to stay that way. So I asked Ice Cream Steve to sponsor me. He initially said no, and they said, no, I'll think about it. And he called me back in a couple of days, and he said, okay. And I said, I'm surrendered. You're final authority on my program of recovery. And he didn't ask for that. I give it. And I said, what do you want me to do? And he laid out some things. And one of them was the exact opposite of something that Don, my previous sponsor, had me doing. The exact opposite. I didn't even tell him. He didn't know that for over a year. And he heard one of my speaker tapes and heard me mention it. That's how he found out. He has not asked what that was. And I have not told him. Because it doesn't matter. What's important to me is what's going on in here. I not only have a sponsor, I am sponsored. And for me, that means that I'm surrendered. I'm doing it his way. When we finish this tonight, he has a ritual that he has me go through. I would not have chosen it. I'm not terribly fond of it. He doesn't know either one of those either. Unless he hears this tape, he won't find out. Because it doesn't matter. It's important to me to continue to do it somebody else's way. I was sponsoring myself the day before I got here, and it was not working. It is really just that simple. So I hold myself accountable to him for the things in my life. And I've had some big deals in my life recently, and he's been fully involved in all of that stuff. He has not made any of my decisions for me. He doesn't do that. But he listens, and if I start off in a screwy way, he asks some pretty pointed questions, and it really helps, I think, to bring me back to center, which is what it's about. For me, the God of my very limited understanding is final authority, and Steve is kind of the sergeant major of that outfit. And I trust what I get, and so far it's working. I think I'm going to stop at this point and let Miss Linda talk for a while, and I've got some more I'm going to talk about in just a moment.
Hello, my name's Linda. Hi, whoa, thank you for being here this afternoon. This is really great. Or compulsive, I don't know which. But I'm glad you're here. I was really frightened by sponsorship because that meant that I was probably going to have to open up and share with another woman. And I wasn't used to that. I lived as an only child, always had my own room, always had all of the back seat. You know, I always kind of hung out with myself and my imaginary friends. And all of a sudden, Al-Anon told me I needed to invite another woman into my life. And that was a real hard thing for me to do. And one of the reasons it was hard is because I had low self-esteem. I did not think I was worthy of another person's time and energy and prayers and thoughts. I did not think that I was worthy of my own recovery. And once I got over that, I realized, okay, it is okay for me to spend time with another woman, for her to listen, for her to share. We've got a great pamphlet called Sponsorship, What's It All About? I'm just going to read just a couple of things. Several pages long. I really recommend it for AA or Al-Anon because it answers great questions like who can be a sponsor, when am I ready to sponsor, how often do I contact my sponsor. I mean, it's really got how do I get rid of a sponsor. That's not exactly the way they word it, but got a lot of good questions like that. But it gives the definition of what is sponsorship. It says it is a mutual and confidential sharing between two Al-Anons, two people. Sponsor and sponsored meet as equals to share. A favorite description of sponsorship relates to being lost in the woods. If you find someone else who was lost, it is comforting when that person says, I'm lost too. Let's see if we can find our way out together. It is also comforting to find someone who says, I was lost, but I was helped to find my way. Come, take my hand, and I'll show you the path. Wow. So I had to get worthy and trust myself to reach out and hold that hand of another human being and start trusting them. Now, when I got my first sponsor, she had what I wanted, a husband and a long marriage and recovery. And I chose her for the wrong reason, but she ended up being a great sponsor for me. She was very, very available, and she was my sponsor for about 5 years. And then through some other rearranging of her life, she decided not to participate in Al-Anon any longer, and I had to go and get another sponsor. And you know, I'm hanging around these rooms, and I checked out the women, and I saw this lady, and I thought, she's going to be really honored. I'm going to ask her to be my sponsor. Oh, how crazy I was. And I called her, and I said, I'd like for you to be my sponsor. And she said, well, I'll have to pray about it. I'll have to think about it. Call me tomorrow. Oh, well, I would pick a sponsor that would say, I'll have to think about it, I have to pray about it. No problem, I'll call her tomorrow. I called her tomorrow and I said, will you be my sponsor? She says, no. Wow. I thought, what is this all about? And you know what? She was a healthy enough woman to say, I've got too much going on, and I could choose to take that personally or not take it personally. And what I realized that I was looking at a woman who was very healthy. She just said no. So that sent me back on the search again. And I'm now with my this lady that's my sponsor that I ask after that. She's been a great sponsor for me. She is absolutely one of the most spiritual women you would ever want to meet. She's got so much serenity around her. And she really got my case and my number really fast. And she says, the first thing she says to me when I call her, she says, "Have you prayed about it?" And you know what? That cuts down on my calling her because I know she's going to say that. So before I pick up the phone and call her, I pray about it. And then it kind of dissipates. And so I don't ever call her. I have to call her for that. She's the one that taught me that it's okay to call your sponsor to say, "Hey, I'm doing great. I'm having a good day." You know, I thought that I could only call and whine and whine and whine. In fact, you know, when I first started working with my sponsor, I did the same thing that I see women do when I first start sponsoring them. I call it singing the hymns. You know, him did that and him did this. Oh, how I love to sing those hymns. But thanks to gracious sponsors, I have been able to move through that. We talk about that we don't give advice, and when I sponsor and my sponsor does not give me advice, she sometimes gives me a multiple choice. You know, well, here's a possibility, here's a possibility, here's a possibility, and that gives me a lot of freedom to have room to wiggle and squirm in that. When someone asks me to be their sponsor, that's a big deal, and I say, like that lady said to me, I have to pray about it, I have to think about that, and would you call me tomorrow or I'll call you. And I honestly look at what my situation looks like. Am I going to be real available to this woman? Am I going to be there when she needs me? What is her situation like? Is she, you know, almost like a crisis situation, and maybe she needs somebody that would be more available? And if I'm not able to take her on, I suggest that she look around, and I usually give her 2 or 3 names of other women that I know that are willing to do that. But if I do decide to work with a woman, we have to sit down and do kind of our pre-sponsor conversation. And this is usually over lunch, or maybe it could even be over the telephone, although I like to do it in person. And the main thing that I try to do in that conversation is to find out this person's understanding of their higher power. When I sponsor women, I use the God thing a lot. Just as my sponsor says, "Have you prayed about it?" I say, "Have you gone to God and talked about this?" Or, you know, "Have you really been in prayer about this?" And I have to know what this person's attitude or understanding of their higher power is, because I can't send them to an unfriendly God. See, if I'm using to co-sponsor with God, and I'm going to send that young woman to talk to their God, and if it's a God that they're still fearful of, or a God that's not forgiving, or a God that's judgmental, I'm not sending them to a safe place. So that's one of the things that we talk about, is what is the God of your understanding? I don't try to change their mind. I just have to know what that is, when I can say, "Well, have you gone to God about it?" I also like to let people know that the sponsorship thing is a thing of having fun. We get into Al-Anon and we just want to do it in a hurry, and we just want to do it right so the pain will go away. And what I know now is that journey is part of what makes the pain go away. And about 2 years ago, I was sponsoring this woman. She was a stockbroker. And I think that she was attracted to me as a sponsor because I was out there in the business world still at that time, and she thought we really were, you know, peas of the same pot. And she came to me and, "Would you be my sponsor?" And she opened up her planner, and "I can meet with you here." And so we worked all this out. And boy, she was a super achiever woman, really strong businesswoman there in Nashville. And so we were going through this and talking about that, and finally I told her, I said, "Well, and now you're going to have to start blowing bubbles." And she's looking down at her literature, and she looks up at me, and she goes, "Blow bubbles?" She says, "Well, I don't have time for that. There's no way. Now, I'll read this literature, and I'll get back with you, but there's no way I'm going to blow bubbles." I said, "You just need to chill out a little bit, and I want you to blow bubbles for 5 minutes every day." She says, "I cannot blow bubbles." And I had a jar of bubbles, and I handed it to her, and I said, "Because you're arguing with me now, you're going to have to sing in the shower." She just closed her mouth really quick, but I saw that woman melt. You know, that's the only word. I saw her rough edges become soft. I saw her voice take off a less metallic tone to it. I really saw this program gentle that woman out. So I do give fun assignments like that. And, I have a woman that I sponsored. I've been sponsoring for quite some time, and she's just great. She's this woman that she tells the story. She really tries to do everything in program in her home life, and her son gave us the best story I know about the first step prayer. He had gotten problems with his little brother. Like the little brother was in his stuff and in his face and just having a really hard time with him. And so she took the big brother aside and said, "Now, look, Ian, we are powerless over people, places, and things." And her son said, "Nouns?" So, yeah. So the wonderful things that we learn from these women that we sponsor, yes, I'm powerless over nouns and sometimes adjectives and adverbs. But this particular woman, I've sponsored her for quite some time. In fact, one night I'd gone to an open AA meeting to meet some friends of mine that I play bridge with, and I heard a young man pick up a chip and tell a little bit of his story. And I didn't catch his last name, and I didn't know him, and I didn't think too much about it. But the next Saturday afternoon, this particular woman was coming to me to do her fifth step. And she started doing her fifth step, and I'm thinking, boy, this sounds familiar. Wow, this really sounds familiar. And then I said, "And then did you move to Washington, D.C.? And she thinks I'm psychic at this point because I'm predicting what her story's going to be. And I had heard her husband celebrate his 3-year chip that night, and so that was kind of an interesting thing. But this woman, we've become friends, which is not a bad thing to happen between a sponsor and a sponsee. But what happens sometimes, she calls me and we start talking, and I go, whoa, wait a minute. Are you talking to Linda, the friend? Are you talking to Linda, your sponsor? And we have to verbally. Recognize that when we first started on the conversation, because I could get way off base with her. And I absolutely love the women that I sponsor. I learn so much from them, and I take a pledge. When a woman asks me to sponsor her, she is not aware of it, but I personally take a pledge, and this is something that I've worked out for myself. And so I get down in prayer and in my heart and in my mind that I have pledged myself to this woman. And this pledge includes that I will stay as healthy as I can to be available there to her. It also means that I will not, like that detachment sheet says, I will not be used or abused even for the sake of her recovery. I will stay on my path, on my journey. This pledge also includes confidentiality. And that includes even with my husband. No matter how close we are, what's going on between me and somebody I sponsor is our business. I didn't come in here with a big pocket of trust. And so I have to have people around me that are trustworthy. And the only way I can know that is if I'm trustworthy myself. I've seen a lot of damage done through gossip and saying something else that was in a private conversation. So I pledge to this person that I will hold confidentiality, and I'm very, very careful about that. I also pledge to this person that I will become a prayer partner with them. I will pray for them. I will pray for their family members. I will pray for their children. They don't have to be aware of that. They just become a part of my prayer package daily. And I also pray with them at really needed times. We will set up, especially when we're working the steps together and we're getting into some of those dark corners. And we've had a really connect session like one afternoon, and now she's going to go back to her familiar world with her family, and I'm going to stay there at my house with my family. And I'll tell her, about 10 o'clock tonight, it's going to be getting scary for you again. So wherever you are, you stop and say a prayer, and wherever I am, I'll stop and say a prayer. So we're actually doing a prayer connect at different locations, but staying together. I also pledge that I will stay current on our Al-Anon literature. Great lessons always coming out with that. And it's part of my responsibility to my own recovery, but also to the women that I sponsor. Let's stay current. I have a lot of women that I tell them to read the Al-Anon literature. The Al-Anon literature in its simplicity and in its hardness of just bearing the soul makes for a really good way to connect. And a lot of times you'll get a person you're sponsoring and you'll show them the ODAT book and they go, oh, I've read that. Or you'll show them something else, oh, I've read that. But sometimes they haven't read the Al-Anon literature, and you can it's a wake-up call. You can kind of get their attention. I think the whole thing about sponsorship for me was I needed to be heard. I needed to have somebody that would stay in one place and listen to me. And sometimes that's all I'm doing, is holding the space, being there and being available and on a consistent basis. I love it when I start working with women. I have this great big wonderful backyard, and it has a hammock in it. And it has a 2-people hammock. 2 people can get in. And these women are so cautious, and I'll have them come over and we're going to do some sponsorship work. And I'll say, come on, let's go climb in the hammock. Well, they try to get in the hammock without ever touching, without ever letting our legs touch or our arms touch. It's impossible. And pretty soon they just have to kind of melt into it. We have to kind of melt into the situation. And we are having a human contact. We're like a couple of puppies out there. And it's intimate, and it's sharing, and it's pure, and it's good. So that's part of my thing about being a sponsor. The thing about listening to a 5th step, I think, is a good thing to think about when you're in a sponsorship situation. And listen is the word. Listen is the word. And to let them know that they're not going to get it all done that first time, that it doesn't have to be the 1 5th step to end off 5th steps, and kind of let them take the lead. I do have a blanket available, because your body temperature usually drops so much. I don't care what time of year you're doing it. Your body temperature physically drops so much that I have a blanket that's, the old granny, grandmother blanket to hold this woman and wrap her in. I guess my overall thing about sponsorship is using it. It's a tool. I've had women that have asked me to be their sponsor, and it was kind of like Scott said a while ago, then I never hear from them. What am I supposed to do in that situation? I usually call them once or twice, but I don't chase them, because I've learned from my own family members that if I keep them from hitting their bottom, it's going to take them longer from getting in here. So I don't chase the women that have asked me to sponsor them. And if they're just saying, oh, yeah, I've got a sponsor, and it's Linda, and they never contact me, then that's something that they're going to have to work out. They're going to have to work out. I think it's great to have a healthy voice. That's what my sponsor is to me. She is a healthy voice. She has heard all of this committee when I call her and I'm going yada da 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 da, and she's that calming, healthy voice. And in this day and age, sometimes I don't even talk to her. Sometimes I'm just leaving a voicemail for her, or I'm just talking to her machine. And that's enough. It gives me some breathing time, some slow down time to find out what's the next right thing to do. So sponsorship doesn't always mean that we have to be available. and I'm sure this is something that you were going to say, but it is something that I learned from you, that when we're traveling or even when I'm not available, if a woman calls me and she just wants to check in, she just says, hi, this is so-and-so, and I'm just saying hello, and, but I'm okay. But if they ever call and say, hi, this is so-and-so, and I need to talk to you, that means I get right back to them. That's a smoke signal. I get right back to them. My dream would be to kind of have all of the women that I sponsor in the same room together sometime, because I think you would have a better workshop on sponsorship if they told you what I'm like to be their sponsor, because, they're more aware of that than I am. I can only tell you that my sponsor is a loving, wonderful woman that this past year, last year, she went through a very, very difficult time, and with a family member, and she wasn't as available to me because she was preoccupied, and I didn't take it personally, and I didn't go off and find another sponsor. I was able to let our history together carry me through that. I like having a sponsor, and I really like Scott having a sponsor. Because there's some times that he can be going, da-da-da-da-da-da, and I can say, have you talked to Ice Cream Steve about that? Sure takes the pressure off of me. Thank you.
That's why we don't work each other's programs, and that's one of the things that we do within the bounds that we've set allow. It's fair for either one of us to say to the other one, will you please talk to your sponsor about that? Have you talked to your sponsor about that? Or how long has it been since you went to a meeting? We can say those things, that we don't go beyond that as far as each other's programs are concerned. I was talking earlier that I didn't know how to use a sponsor. It hadn't occurred to me that I would be used by a sponsor. It was just one of those things I had on backwards. That my sponsor was sending me out to all kinds of places. You're going to start taking this meeting into this treatment center and meet me at this place. And at 6 months, I spoke at my first meeting, scared to death. And I just got out and I started doing it his way. And I want to talk a little bit about sponsorship as it has been handed down to me. I think probably I used to think that my first responsibility was to coach someone through the steps, and I've put one before that now. I believe my first responsibility is to love them. I'm told that God is love, and if I give love, I'm giving God, and that's maybe the most thing I can do. The second thing I must do is to, I think in some ways, try to convince them that if they'll do the things I've done, they'll get what I have, and I assume they want what I have, or they wouldn't have asked me to sponsor them. And that has to do with doing the step work straight out of the book. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. It's also my responsibility, as I said before, to stay in the boat. I was real nervous when I first started sponsoring people about what if this guy doesn't make it, or what if he does? And my sponsor told me that he said, don't take credit for the ones that make it, because if you do, you're stuck with the blame for the ones that don't, and some of them will die. And I read an article in the Grapevine one time, and there was a fellow that was fixing to go to work at a central office in a major city, and he realized that answering the phones there was literally life and death for people, and he was terrified by that prospect. And one of the old timers said, don't worry about it. He said, if they're ready, you can't do anything wrong, and if they're not ready, you can't do anything right. And I believe that carries over into sponsorship, that it's just not my responsibility. It's my responsibility to offer my time and to try to be, I try to be the pipe to let the living water of God and this program flow through me. But I'm not responsible I don't get credit for the ones that make it, and I'm not stuck with the blame for the ones that don't. It's my responsibility to tell them the truth. And one of my favorite times to do that includes cheering for them when I think they're growing. And I never lie to them about that. I try not to lie to them about anything, but is to tell them the truth. And one of the things I look for is the first time one of them comes to me and says, I lied to you about something. I give a lot of assignments, and they'll say he did something and come to me and just hangdog and say, I said I did that and I didn't. And I always cheer. I think, boy, isn't that fantastic? He's so committed to his own program of recovery, because he doesn't know what I'm going to do. He's so committed to his own program, and he's so far along that he can't live with the fact that he lied about that. And I always cheer for that. I knew he was going to lie to me before I met him. He's a drunk, right? That's a given. Him lying to me didn't hurt me a bit. But I'm so excited the first time they can admit it, because that is such a milestone. And I ask them to believe that I believe what I'm telling them. They don't have to believe it. That's not necessary. What they believe and what they think is worth nothing. I mean, if I wanted what he believed and what he thought, I'd ask him to be my sponsor. We're going the other way. I don't care what he thinks. We're trying to get all that stuff changed anyway. But I love to cheer for their growth. And I'm at the risk of letting the big secret out of the bag. For those of you who have wondered how your sponsor knows when you start shoveling it at them, I am going to tell you from the secret sponsor school, the BS filters that the sponsors have in their ears, I'm going to tell you what they are. When someone I sponsor is talking to me and he's rattling on, everything after yes, but is BS. Okay? That's how they know. It's everything after the yes, but. Boy, that has helped me so much when I listen to him talk and when I listen to me talk. Because it's true for them. It's true for me. I honor what Linda talks about, her commitment to the people that she sponsors has helped me so much. But I really honor their anonymity. And I don't ever discuss them with anyone, even my sponsor, without their direct permission. And I may say to someone, I want to take that to my sponsor, may I? And if they say no, I won't do it. On rare occasion, it is pretty rare, because a lot of us in AA wind up with Al-Anon issues of some kind. I'll say, I think it would be helpful for me to talk to my wife about that. Do I have your permission to do that? Try to be real specific about that. And when someone I sponsor comes to me with something about someone they sponsor, I say, wait, do you have his permission to talk to that subject with me? And if the answer is no, I say, then get it, or let's don't talk either way. And that helps me keep it clean. I'm also willing to chase men that I sponsor a little bit. If I don't hear from them, I will call them a few times, and then we'll have a discussion about that. And I just did that with a fellow that's sober 10 years. And I said, I've called you the last 5 times we've talked. I'm willing to do that some, but I'm approaching the end. Now you think about it. And I think that's a fair thing. I, too, like to explore this idea of the God of someone else's understanding. Most of us, I think, in my experience, get here with a God that I wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. And it's pretty darn difficult to, at the third step, make the decision to turn your will and life over to a God that's waiting to hammer you. So there are changes that need to be made, or at least attempted to make, I think. Most of the problems that I have in my life today fall under what I call Step 1, Section B. My life's unmanageable. Well, if I can't manage my life, I can't manage theirs either. And I don't think that's my job. My job is to try to get them focused into the work in this book so that they can be changed by the work and so that they can develop their own relationship with God. I'm willing to listen to their problems once. If somebody starts telling me about the same problem over again, I interrupt. I'll be glad to talk solutions until dawn. But I can't personally stand listening to the problem very long, because it just doesn't feed my spirit. But boy, I'll explore solutions until first light. Love to talk about the solutions. And I don't think it does them any good to sit and talk about the problem and beat it to death over and over and over again. If you haven't read Dr. Paul's Dr. Alcoholic Addict in the text, I think you'd really enjoy that, where he addresses that. Well, let's live in the solution, and the solution will grow. And then what I try to do is to let's explore options. And I don't want to make their choices for them. I think if I make somebody else's choices, what they learn is that I'll make their choices. If I stand out of the way and they make their choices, they learn to make their choices and live with the results and eventually make better choices. So it's not my responsibility. But if I see them heading on one, I think it's really dangerous. I do try to ask some questions. But to explore options, and I like to lay this one out. Somebody's mad at his boss. I say, well, what are all the options that you can think of? And he says, well, I could quit. Yeah, all right, that's an option. Or I could go to his boss. Yeah, that's an option. All right, write that down. And he says, I could just gut it out, I guess, and not say anything. Yeah, that's an option. What else? He says, that's all I can think of. I say, well, you could buy a 12-gauge shotgun and kill him. Write it down. Because I think if we'll look at that, it has a much less chance of happening. So let's look at all the possible options. And usually I see 2 or 3, including that one, that they don't see. And then they go from there. I like to do willingness checks. Linda mentioned bubbles. We are both bubble junkies. And I will frequently assign someone to blow bubbles. I have a fellow I sponsor now, and I have his permission to tell this, who was he was making a lot of money a year, and is now waiting tables or whatever. But I handed him a jar of bubbles, and I said, I want you to blow bubbles 5 minutes a day. And I want to know how long they last, what color they are, how big did they get, how high. I want you in the moment blowing the bubbles, because this guy was tight as a tick. And it's so hard for us to learn to enjoy, and I enjoy the bubbles, so I hand this guy the jar of bubbles. 60 days later, he's still telling me about these bubbles, but his voice doesn't sound too good. And I said, are you you're still blowing bubbles every day? He said, yep, 5 minutes. I said, are you enjoying it? He said, nope. I said, okay, why are you still doing it? He said, you told me to, and if that's the price to have you for a sponsor, I'll pay it. I said, put the bubbles down. It's willingness. I thought that defined it so beautifully. In 60 days, he still didn't love to do bubbles. Not that that's what you need for recovery, but it's that willingness thing. I need that, right? I have to play, and I have to play childlike. I also expect from a newcomer daily contact. I talk to him every day for the first 60 or 90 days. And I also use what Linda talked about. If someone leaves me a message that contains the word need, I get back to them. And I tell them, when you call me during business hours, if your tail feathers are on fire, use the word need in your first sentence. And then I put them on hold and get somebody else off the phone and take it. Because I believe in need. I believe in big deals. I believe hangnails can be big deals. I think a 30-day chip is a big deal. I've had some big deals myself. One of the things that I started doing recently, and I've asked the men that I sponsor, and I've got a lot of friends that are doing this now, is we stopped getting newcomers' phone numbers. We started exchanging phone numbers with newcomers. When I was new, I bet by the time I had a 60-day chip, I had 100 phone numbers, and I ain't dialed a one. And now, with a few years sober, that phone doesn't weigh 1,000 pounds for me. I can pick it up. There's nothing for me to pick up the phone and call a new guy and say, hey, how you doing? I'm going to thus and such meeting tonight. You want to go? That's easy for me. I remember that Bill Wilson reached out to Dr. Bob. The sober member reached to the drunk one the first time. It's not enough for the hand of AA to be here. I have to try to reach it out. And I think picking up, when I take a newcomer's phone, I don't give my phone number without getting his. If I'm not willing to call him, I don't give him my number. And I take responsibility for giving a newcomer 2 calls within 3 days when I do that, just to check in with them, just to say hi. I wonder if everybody in AA did that forever and one more person got sober. Wouldn't it be? It's been necessary for me on several occasions to change sponsors, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I know some people don't believe in that, and that's fine. Whatever's working for you is okay with me. I'm not here to sell mine. It's just my experience. I change sponsors when it's not working for me. I had to change sponsors from the man that's the most spiritual man I've ever met. It was then, is now. And it was because he was unavailable. And when I called him, and the way I change sponsors, I go to the old one and I thank him. And I say, thank you for the time you've spent for me. Thank you for helping me grow. Thank you for all you've done. I've asked someone else to sponsor me. And I thought I should tell you. And then I'll answer questions if he asks. He didn't. I called him on a Friday to tell him that I'd asked someone else to sponsor me. It was the following Tuesday when he got back to me. And I was in the middle of a divorce. And I was a walking emergency. That's nothing against him. I still love him and admire him tremendously. His life was so full he didn't have room for me. It was time for me to move on. I heard a guy, after a meeting, said one time that said his sponsor had told him, he said, be at my house tonight at 7 o'clock, bring your wife. So he was there. They saw an Amway presentation and were told, I shouldn't have said Amway, but they saw one of those. I didn't mean to do that because there's nothing against that particular organization, but they saw a sales presentation of some kind that was not recovery related. And he found it necessary to change sponsors because he felt that was outside of bounds. So there are reasons for doing those kinds of things. And I find it easy to just say, thank you. This particular man I was just talking about, when I was sober about 5 years, I was talking to him about this one particular guy I was sponsoring, and he said, I want you to fire him. And I said, what? He said, I want you to go tell him that you're not going to be his sponsor anymore. I said, you can't mean that. He said, yeah, I do mean that. And he and I had multiple conversations, and this is the way that one went. He said, how many things are you asking him to do right now that he's not doing? And I named about 5. I said, about 5, I guess. He said, what are they? And I said, call his parole officer, look for a job, read a couple of pages in the big book every day, go to a meeting every day, start his 4th step. and pray. And he said, he's not doing any of those? And I said, no. He said, you're not his sponsor, he is. You're his fire chief. You're 911. He called you when his tail feathers are on fire. And you race to the rescue. He said, how do you feel when you get through talking to him after you talked to him for 45 minutes? How do you feel? I said, drained. I'm just worn out, limp. He named another man I was sponsoring. He said, how do you feel after you talk to him? I said, great. I'm invigorated. He said, this is not working for you. It's not working for you. You're supposed to feel invigorated. When the Spirit flows through you, it energizes you. It lights you up. He said something else. He said, you're not sponsoring this guy. You're not his sponsor. He is. He said, could you stay sober working the program this man's working? I said, I don't think so. He said, do you think he can? I said, no, I don't think so. He said, you must tell him that. And it isn't for him. It's for you. Because if you're right and he goes back out, if he kills somebody or himself or goes to prison or something else horrible happens in his life, you're going to have to be able to sleep knowing that you told him the truth. I couldn't argue with it. And I want you to know that I don't believe in tough love. I think the words are mutually exclusive. I have never seen what was told to me as tough love that didn't look like unresolved control issues. I didn't go tough to this man. I went with a very heavy heart, and I sat him in my car. And I said, my sponsor sent me. And I said, I don't want to do this. Talk me out of it. Here are the things I'm asking you to do. Are you willing to do them? And he said, no. And I said, I'm not your sponsor, you are. And I don't think you can stay sober doing this. And I have to tell you that so I can sleep. I want you to stay sober. I want you to say, okay, I'll do what you're saying. I want us to keep this together. You have to make the call. I'm willing to try it one more time. I think one of the most important things that we do, welcoming newcomers, is in the same category as this, and that's making it easy for people to come back. God knows if I go back out, I sure hope you make it easy for me to come back. Because I got my life bet on this. And I've got to make it easy as I can for people to come back. And I was trying to make it easy for Kim to come back because I didn't think he was going to make it. And he didn't last long after that. But I wasn't keeping him sober. It wasn't working. It wasn't working for either one of us. I know people that say that you shouldn't do that, do what I did. This is page 96 in the text at the top. Do not be discouraged if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. We find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you. If you leave such a person alone, he may soon become convinced that he cannot recover by himself. To spend too much time on any one situation is to deny some other alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy. Page 96 in the text. I had to do that. Broke my heart. I'm still sad about it. And it was still the right thing to do for me. I've had to do it since then. I hope I don't ever have to do it again. Whew. It's been my experience as I begin to try to coach men through the steps that there tends to be a balking at about step 4. Step 4 is kind of a frightening thing. It's I try to remind them that there's nothing in your 4th step that you don't already know. And that there really aren't going to be any surprises in it. And I was privileged to be a member of a group of men. We called ourselves the Bill Wilson Literary Society, and we started 9 years ago. And we came through the Big Book not as a study, but as a workshop. And when the Big Book, first 100 who wrote that said they did something, we stopped there and did it. So we came through and did the Big Book. We're all still sober today. I can't not point at another group I was in 9 years ago and say we're all still sober today. Pretty amazing what happened. But we discovered the 4th step in the Big Book. We counted 26 individual directions on the 4th step. Most of them are not about writing. It was for me and for the men that I have had the privilege of coaching through this work, the observations and prayers in the 4th step in the Big Book where the changes happen. The writing had very little therapeutic effect. It was important for me to make those observations and to pray those prayers so that I could be changed. It's my favorite topic. If somebody wants to talk about that later, I love to talk about it. Okay, I'm going to have to leave that alone because that's a 2-hour workshop.
It is the 4-step thing. But if people get to 4 or 5 and you can't get them moving on it, my experience has been that their God's too small. And that it's time to talk again about, a friend of mine says, God forgives me for everything I ever did, and He loved me while I was doing it. I made my God bigger. I appreciate that. I appreciate it when somebody says something that makes my God bigger. And what I need to do with these guys is to help them enlarge their God so that they can be forgiven. Most of us get here having committed the unforgivable sin. And it was important for me to have a God who could forgive me and love me while I was doing it, so that I would have the courage to move through these difficult steps. But 4, 5, and 9, if I can't get them moving, usually it's time to have a conversation about a God who's keeping score and they're already going to go to hell. Linda talked about the 5th step. The way my lineage did the 5th step was that we exchanged 5th steps. I did that last weekend. A fellow came and spent the weekend at the house, and he and I exchanged 5th steps. I don't do my whole one, but I get the 5 or 10 low points and make sure that they're covered in mine. And I hear his. And then I send him alone to do the second half of the 5th step. The silent, the 1 hour of meditation, etc. You know what I'm talking about, the bottom of page 75. And then to do 6 and 7. According to my big book, they're done on the same day. And I watch the light come on in his eyes again. And I watch the process continue to work. And that's one of the joys of my life. What I've been given is so wonderful, and there's so much of it, it's under pressure. I have a need to give it. That's why I need to sponsor men. How many times I've heard myself telling somebody that I sponsor something that I needed to hear. How many times one of them has asked a question that has opened a door for me. How many times, boy, this is powerful. How many times I've had them ask me a question, and as my mouth opened and the answer came out, I realized that I did not know the answer, but the answer that I gave was true. And all I can say is that I think it flowed through me, which was the answer to my prayer. And I've heard myself telling people things that I did not know that were true, that were powerful, powerful. What a joy it is, and what a privilege to sponsor someone. It's been my experience that most of the problems that I deal with in the men that I sponsor fall under Step 1, Section B. They're trying to manage something or have lost the one day at a time concept, that they're reaching out into the future and borrowing pain or trying to wrestle something that's not part of today's assignment. So easy to talk about that. And we talk about that one day at a time a lot. When I got sober, I thought it meant don't drink today. And if you're new, that is exactly what it means. I don't want to take that away. It does mean that. But eventually it was necessary for me to also learn to live in this day. I want to announce at the end of every meeting, like today, if somebody were to say, are there any announcements? I would want to say, yeah, it's Saturday. Be there. To remind me that that's what my responsibility is, to be here. I think it's important for me as a sponsor also to realize when I run across something that's beyond my scope, that's beyond my ability to give assistance. I'm on page 133 in the text. But this does not mean that we disregard human health measures. God has abundantly supplied this world with fine doctors, psychologists, and practitioners of various kinds. Do not hesitate to take your health problems to such persons. Most of them give freely of themselves, that their fellows may enjoy sound minds and bodies. Try to remember that though God has wrought miracles among us, we should never belittle a good doctor or psychiatrist. Their services are often indispensable in treating a newcomer and in following his case afterward. I am not bashful if somebody looks like they're that sick to send them to professional help. That's what the book said to do on page 133. And that's been important to me, that I'm not the savior. I'm not the cure-all. I don't claim to have all the answers. When I start thinking I have all the answers, I'm starting to need work myself real bad. I just throw it in because it's my favorite quotation from my third sponsor, who said, I'm not responsible for what I think, but I'm responsible for how long I think it. That's been important for me to pass on. God gave me permission to be human. I can't keep it from getting dirty up here, but I can sweep. That's a freedom. One of my favorite quotations from Bill Wilson. We go on 12-step calls not because they are alcoholics, but because we are. That I sponsor not because they need sponsorship, but because I need to sponsor. Because it's part of my program to try to pass it along. The Buddhists have a wonderful saying. They say the only way to get into heaven is to bring somebody with you. And I think that has to do with sponsorship, to try to bring somebody with you. I heartily recommend the AA pamphlet, Questions and Answers on Sponsorship. There's a lot of good information in that. And I want to read one more time from the text. This is Chapter 7, Working with Others, page 89. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It is my program. And it doesn't belong to me. And I don't get to give it. But my experience has been the ones that come with enough willingness get it. A friend of ours in Nashville has a wonderful saying. He says, if I could give every newcomer coming through the door just one thing, it'd be 500 cc's of desperation right in the butt. Just load them up. For me, it was the willingness. Everything else I had and everything else I knew had to be laid down. And that's what I try to look for in men that I sponsor. What do you got?
I just want to say one more thing. Scott reminded me of that thing that, there's a song from that musical, From Your Students You'll Be Taught, and that's kind of from your sponsees you'll be taught. And one of the most precious lessons I've learned was I was sponsoring this woman that it had been her dream forever to go back to school. She had put her husband, worked while he was in school, not put him through school, but together they had worked it out. So he went through school, including a PhD. She had 3 children. They had all gone to college, and she wanted to go back to school. Finally, one fall came. She enrolled, and she was going to school. She'd been going. It'd been her dream for so long. She called me about 4 weeks into this semester, and she was absolutely crazy. This is a woman that was solid in the program. She says, I can't tell you what's going on, but I'm absolutely crazy. And in talking to her and praying for me to try to connect and try to know what was going on, the light bulb went off. And I said, I know what's going on. You lost a dream. Your dream became reality, and you don't have another dream. I said, you're grieving for the loss of the dream, even though she was doing what she wanted to do. That was a beautiful lesson for me. And I found it in my own life, and I found it in the lives of other women that I sponsor. A lot of times it comes with the ending of a relationship, that we are grieving the loss of the dream of what could have been. And that was a lesson I would have never have gotten if I hadn't been sponsoring this woman. I just wanted to say, because this is going to be my last time, I'm going to get to take some time off, and I'm looking forward to hearing Scott speak tonight. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the invitation to be here. It's been great. I have friends here in this area. And last night, very graciously, you gave us that wonderful work of art made out of the Mississippi mud, a statue in the shape of a squirrel. And I've been wondering what I was going to name that squirrel. And I want you to know her new name is Delta. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks. And so if you're new here and you don't have a sponsor and you want a sponsor, please see Mike right after this meeting. If you're new here and you don't have a sponsor and don't think you need one, see me. Okay? Do somebody a favor and let them sponsor you. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then if somebody has questions or things that you'd like to share or whatever, write them on these pieces of paper, bring them up here, and we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes. And let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Alcoholic. And thanks for coming back. Let's open with a few moments of silence and invite God to join us. Serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you. This is our questions and whatever we can come up with portion of the afternoon. We got one left over from this morning on relationships, and it says you mentioned that you and Linda have cuddle time in bed as prayer time. Do you pray out loud or silently, Are they set prayers, i.e. memorize the Lord's Prayer, etc.? Yeah, it's answer D, all of the above. Most often it's silent, but occasionally we pray outdoors, outside, out loud. I want to get a nap, and I promise I'm going to get a nap. And we also, on occasion, as Linda has this wonderful gift for meditations, guided imagery, things that just sort of show up for her. And when she gets a new one, sometimes she'll bless me by leading us in a guided imagery meditation. And have had the privilege of having that happen about 40 times in the last 3 years. And so sometimes we do it out loud, and it's just whatever strikes us. And I'm really thrilled by this question because as you're exploring, this sounds like someone who's going to explore that to yourself. I would encourage you, talk to your partner about it and explore it, and try different things and see what works for you.
I just wanted to say one quick thing about the prayer. This isn't especially an answer to that question, but I had to give myself permission to pray on my knees in front of Scott, to be comfortable enough with that, and that's really worked out, but I had to work at it, because I had been used to praying on my knees before he and I knew each other, and so I couldn't see stopping just because I was sharing a bedroom. So now I had to be quite comfortable for him to walk in and see that, and now we participate in that together on many, many occasions.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. Don't sit down. It says, what is a manageable number of people to sponsor effectively?
Behind door number 3, is that what I'm supposed to say? Boy, I don't know. I think you'd have to address that with your sponsor and with your higher power. You know, I think one of the things we have established about the sponsorship, not that we've established up here, but in general, is that it's something that when you have enough time to give to somebody, you know, you have to be available, you have to be present when you're talking to them, either in person or by phone. And sometimes our schedules don't allow for that. For myself, it has to be when I can feel like I can give quality time without threatening my own program, that I'd be interested in taking on someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo that too. I don't take on anyone new to sponsor without talking to my sponsor. I found myself, I'm sponsoring 4 men that live out of my town that are long distance. 3 of them are out of state. And he told me not to take on any more like that. And I didn't ask him why. I just not taking on anybody else out of town. Just that simple. I think it's a great question to ask your sponsor. I want to cover something else too. We talked earlier about this checklist, this couples dialogue thing. Someone was kind enough to run a bunch of copies, and they're up here. And please come get one if you'd like to have one. I think you'll find it'll be helpful. Also, during the break, someone mentioned suicide to me, and I appreciate that very much. I'm not going to talk about what I was told, but the experience that I had. When I was sober about 2 years, a fellow named Bill from my home group, also sober about 2 years, we arrived at about the same time at the old Woodbine Clubhouse in Nashville. And we had the same guy sponsoring us. And at about 2 years, he drove home from a meeting one night, pulled into the garage, dropped the door, and left it running, and died. And that was the first time I'd been involved, not been involved, but had seen that. And a number of years later, it occurred to me, and I asked that sponsor, what was the difference? How is it that Bill Wagner drove home and killed himself, and here I am, alive and happy inside my own skin and doing pretty good? What was the difference? And he said, I couldn't get him to do a 4-step. I could not get the man to do a 4-step. He was brimful of anger and resentment, and every time you saw him, some SOB had just done something to him, and he was not willing to lay that down, and it killed him. I said, booze was not his problem, it was his answer. And he laid down that answer and did not pick up this one. And he was in the fellowship, but he was not in the program. And he didn't have the changes in his heart that you had because he didn't do the work you did, and that was the difference. I don't judge him. I miss him. I'm sorry it has to happen to anybody. It's a sad thing. I, too, have been to too many funerals, and sometimes it makes me harsh when I start talking about the difference between the fellowship and the program. And I say that in 13 and a half years, I have yet to see anyone in and out of this program. I hear it, but I haven't seen it. In and out of the fellowship, I see that almost every day. I've seen busloads. In and out of the program, no. I have not seen anyone get a sponsor work these 12 steps following the directions in this book, stay active, and drink. I have not seen that combination. The boy in my home group sober about 11 years, and the other day we were talking about the 5th step. And my home group average sobriety is about 6 years, and a lot of people in there that have done this step work. And person after person talked about the freedom they got doing the 5th step. And we called on this particular guy, and he said, I only see 3 things happen to people that show up at AA. He said they either drink again, they commit suicide, or they do the 12 steps. And that's been my experience too. And I'm sorry if it's harsh, but I've been to too many funerals of wonderful people just like us. So I have to come and tell that story. Yeah.
In Al-Anon, what I've learned and what it says in our preamble and at the opening of all of our meetings, that we believe alcoholism is a family disease. A family disease. And it's now recognized by the Medical Association that it is a disease. And what I know about the disease through Al-Anon is that I didn't cure it, I didn't cause it, I can't control it, and I can't cure it. That's what we call the 3 C's. So when you're working with someone, you have to keep that in mind, that you didn't cause it, and you can't control it, and you can't cure it any more than we can any of the other diseases. And so that was a big relief for me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. There's another set of questions here that are wonderful. It said, how do you encourage sponsorship in your home group? I think that's a great question. One of the things that I do is I refer to my sponsor when I speak in discussion meetings and the things that I've gotten, and I refer to my sponsorship and how much it's meant to me. The other thing is that I'm a greeter at my home group, and some of the men that I sponsor are too. And what we're doing is, those of you who know us, yeah, we're glad to see you too, but we're looking for new people. That's my purpose as a greeter. I'm trying to catch the rookie at his first meeting coming through the door. And when I establish that's who he is, then I take the responsibility for taking him over to some people that would make good sponsors for him. And I ask him the question, I say, have you got a sponsor yet, or a temporary sponsor? And they say, well, no, what is that? And I said, well, it's kind of like a big brother, and he sort of gets you started and kind of help you show you the ropes kind of thing. It's not at this point, not a major commitment for you or for him, but it's just a good way to get started. And there's a guy over here to make a good one for you. Why don't let me introduce you to him? I walk him over to a guy that I sponsor, that I know is going to say yes if I ask a question. And I say, hey, Fred, would you be temporary that says yes or needs a new sponsor? And he knows that before I got there, right? He knows what's happening. He sees me coming across the floor with a guy he doesn't know. And so you leave him like that. And I heard a wonderful story on tape one time. A guy said he showed up at his very first meeting, and he was walking up the steps, and there's a guy sitting on the steps drinking a cup of coffee. He looked up as he came by, and he said, are you at your first meeting? And the guy said, yeah. He says, well, sit down here next to me. I'm your sponsor, and I want to tell you something. He says, I want you to throw yourself into this thing like your very life depends on it, and like this is the last chance you're ever going to get, because it might be. And that guy's still sober, and that man's still his sponsor. I believe in sponsorship. And they can change, and, it works or it doesn't work. But I like the idea of giving them a sponsor. I just believe in doing it.
I like that question of how do you encourage sponsorship in your home group? This is what I encourage any topic in my home group. If someone's saying, we're having a problem with crosstalk, or we're having a problem with such and such or such and such, sponsorship, I volunteer to be the chairperson, and I set the topic, and we have a whole meeting around it. So that's how I encourage sponsorship in our group. We talk about it. What I encourage any topic in my home group. If someone's saying, we're having a problem with crosstalk, or we're having a problem with such and such or such and such, sponsorship, I volunteer to be the chairperson topic, and we have a whole meeting around it. So that's how I encourage sponsorship in our group. We talk about it.
I've already answered the second question. Said, how do you feel about extending an offer of sponsorship to newcomers? I believe in it. And I'll tell you what, if you've been around a while and you're looking for someone to sponsor, do what I was talking about earlier and get their phone number and call them 3 or 4 times and take them to lunch. There's nothing to it. There's nothing to it. That was all I had, unless there were some other questions. I had a suggestion came in rather than a question from someone, and it really touched me, and I'm going to try to follow it.
Someone suggested I read the last couple of paragraphs on page 164, and I'm not sure I can, but I'm sure going to try. It says, our book is meant to be suggestive only. We realize we know only a little. God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. Ask Him in your morning meditation what you can do for the man who is still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order. But obviously you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to it that your relationship with Him is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. This is the great fact for us. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God keep you. May God bless you and keep you until then. We thank you all so much.